Endurance is probably the physical capacity that most directly determines the quality and the length of your life. Not maximum strength, not speed, not muscle size. The capacity to sustain effort over the time required by what matters most, whether that is a training session, a long-distance race, a long day of physical work, or simply the sustained energy that allows an active and engaged life well into advanced age. And yet, most people who train have a profoundly incomplete understanding of what endurance actually is in biological terms, how many distinct types exist, what adaptations each type of training produces, and how to program those different types in ways that potentiate rather than interfere with each other. Today, we are going to cover all of that with precision. Welcome to the Huberman Lab podcast, where we discuss science and science-based tools for everyday life. I am Andrew Huberman, and I am a professor of neurobiology and ophthalmology at Stanford School of Medicine. Today's episode is entirely dedicated to the science and the protocols of endurance. And I want to establish from the beginning that endurance is not a single thing. It is a family of related but distinct capacities, each with its own physiological underpinnings, its own training methods, and its own specific adaptations in the body and the brain. Failing to understand those distinctions is one of the most common and most costly errors in training program design. People train one type of endurance and expect another type to improve, or they train multiple types simultaneously in ways that interfere with each other's adaptations. Today, we are going to give you the complete picture, the neuroscience and physiology of how endurance actually works, the four major types of endurance training, and the specific protocols for each, the adaptations those protocols produce in muscle, heart, lung, and neural tissue, and the role of hydration and electrolytes in all of it, which turns out to be more important and more specific than most people appreciate. Timestamps are in the description below, so please feel free to navigate directly to the sections most relevant to you. Before we get into the science, let me thank our sponsors. Sponsor mention AG1. I take AG1 every morning as my foundational nutritional supplement covering vitamins, minerals, adaptogens, and probiotics in a single serving. Go to drinkag1.com/Huberman for a free 1-year supply of vitamin D 3 plus K2 with your first order. Sponsor mention 8 Sleep. Sleep is the foundation of recovery and of the specific adaptations we will discuss today. 8 Sleep's pod mattress cover automatically adjusts your sleep surface temperature throughout the night to optimize sleep quality and recovery. Visit 8sleep.com/Huberman to learn more. Sponsor mention LMNT. Hydration and electrolytes are not a side topic in today's episode. They are central to the neuroscience of endurance. LMNT provides the sodium, potassium, and magnesium your neurons need to sustain effort. Go to drinklmnt.com/Huberman for a free sample pack with any order. Without further ado, let's dive in. I want to begin with the fundamental question of what endurance actually is at the biological level, because the answer is more complex and more interesting than most training discussions acknowledge. In its most basic formulation, endurance is the capacity of the body and the brain to sustain physical effort over time. But that formulation immediately raises a more specific question. What limits it? What is the actual bottleneck that determines when effort can no longer be maintained? And the answer to that question is the key to understanding how to train endurance intelligently, because different training methods target different bottlenecks, and the bottleneck that limits your performance in a given context determines which training method will be most effective. The traditional answer in exercise physiology has been that endurance is limited primarily by peripheral factors: oxygen delivery to working muscles, lactate accumulation, glycogen depletion, and cardiovascular capacity. And these factors are real and important, but the research of the past 2 decades has added a dimension that was previously underappreciated: the central nervous system and the brain's regulation of effort. Tim Noakes's central governor model, developed at the University of Cape Town and supported by a substantial body of experimental evidence, proposes that the brain actively regulates physical output based on a continuous assessment of physiological state, energy reserves, and perceived threat to homeostasis. In this model, the point of exhaustion is not the point at which the muscles genuinely cannot contract. It is the point at which the brain's protective regulation of output brings effort to a halt before catastrophic physiological failure occurs. The evidence for this includes studies showing that subjects who have been told to stop running because they are exhausted can, when the finish line suddenly appears closer than they thought, produce a sprint finish that would have been impossible if true muscular exhaustion had been reached. The body had more in reserve, the brain was regulating output conservatively. This means that endurance training is not only training the muscles and the cardiovascular system, it is training the brain's assessment of what level of effort is safe to sustain. It is recalibrating the central governor's thresholds upward so that more effort can be sustained before the regulatory system intervenes. The neuroscience of this is direct and important. The brain regions involved in the central governor function include the anterior cingulate cortex, which is involved in effort assessment, and the computation of the cost-benefit ratio of continued effort. The insular cortex, which integrates interoceptive signals from the body and contributes to the subjective experience of effort and fatigue. The motor cortex and its descending pathways, which translate the brain's decision about how much effort to produce into actual motor commands to working muscles. And the dopaminergic and serotonergic systems, which modulate the willingness to maintain effort under conditions of accumulating fatigue and discomfort. Research by Samuele Marcora at the University of Kent has been particularly important in elucidating the role of perceived effort in endurance performance. His psychobiological model of endurance proposes that the primary limiter of endurance performance in most contexts is not peripheral physiological capacity, but the brain's tolerance for the effort sensation, which he distinguishes from the pain of injury as a separate and distinct experience. His experimental work has shown that interventions that reduce perceived effort, including caffeine, certain psychological techniques, and even subliminal priming with positive motivational cues, improve endurance performance without changing the peripheral physiological parameters of oxygen consumption, lactate, or muscle fiber activation. This is powerful evidence that the brain is a genuine primary governor of endurance performance and that training the brain alongside the body is essential for maximizing endurance capacity. The energy systems that fuel endurance effort are the second foundational element to understand because the type of energy system predominating during an effort determines which physiological systems are being stressed and which adaptations will be produced by that stress. There are three primary energy systems in human physiology. The phosphocreatine system produces ATP most rapidly, essentially instantaneously, from the stored phosphocreatine in muscle cells. It can sustain maximal effort for approximately 8 to 12 seconds before its stores are depleted. It is the primary energy system for maximal sprints and for explosive maximal efforts of very short duration. It regenerates relatively quickly within approximately 2 to 5 minutes of rest. The glycolytic system produces ATP from glucose, both anaerobically, without oxygen, and aerobically, with oxygen. Anaerobic glycolysis operates without oxygen and produces lactate as a byproduct. It is faster than oxidative metabolism and can sustain high-intensity efforts for roughly 30 seconds to 2 minutes at maximal output. Aerobic glycolysis and oxidative phosphorylation produce ATP more slowly but much more efficiently and can be sustained indefinitely as long as substrate, meaning glucose or fatty acids, and oxygen are available. The crossover point between predominantly anaerobic and predominantly aerobic metabolism is not a hard line but a continuum. And where that crossover occurs at a given exercise intensity is one of the primary determinants of endurance capacity. Training shifts that crossover point, allowing higher intensities to be sustained aerobically, which is more efficient and less limited by substrate depletion. All three systems operate simultaneously at all exercise intensities. The question is, which contributes most to total energy production at a given intensity and duration? The oxygen delivery system is the third foundational element. The cardiovascular system, meaning the heart, the blood vessels, and the blood itself, delivers oxygen from the lungs to working muscles. The key variables are cardiac output, which is heart rate multiplied by stroke volume, meaning the amount of blood pumped per beat, hemoglobin concentration, which determines how much oxygen the blood can carry per unit volume, and the peripheral vasodilation and capillarization of working muscles, which determines how efficiently oxygen is extracted from the blood at the tissue level. VO2 max, the maximum rate of oxygen consumption during maximal exercise, is determined by all of these factors and is one of the most widely used measures of cardiovascular fitness. Research has established that VO2 max is one of the most robust predictors of all-cause mortality in the population, with higher values associated with significantly reduced risk of cardiovascular disease, metabolic disease, and all-cause death. Data published in JAMA Network Open found that the reduction in all-cause mortality associated with improvements in cardiorespiratory fitness from low to above average was larger than the reductions associated with quitting, smoking, treating hypertension, or other commonly targeted cardiovascular risk factors. VO2 max is trainable throughout the lifespan. It peaks in the mid-20s and declines approximately 10% per decade without training. But regular aerobic training dramatically attenuates this decline and can maintain VO2 max well into advanced age. Sponsor break 1 to 2 minutes. Now I want to describe the 4 major types of endurance, their physiological basis, and the specific training protocols for each. I will be precise about the protocols because the precision is what makes them useful rather than merely informative. The first type is long duration, low intensity, steady state endurance, which I will refer to as Zone 2 training. Zone 2 corresponds to exercise intensities at which you can maintain a conversation, which corresponds approximately to 60 to 70% of maximum heart rate for most people, or to the upper boundary of fat oxidation as the primary fuel source. At this intensity, oxidative metabolism in slow-twitch muscle fibers, specifically the type 1 fibers that are highly mitochondria dense, is predominating. The physiological adaptations produced by consistent Zone 2 training are extraordinary in their breadth and their magnitude. Mitochondrial biogenesis, meaning the formation of new mitochondria within muscle fibers, is strongly stimulated by Zone 2, exercise through the activation of PGC, 1-alpha, a transcriptional coactivator that functions as a master regulator of mitochondrial development. More mitochondria within a muscle fiber means greater capacity for oxidative ATP production, which means that at any given exercise intensity, the muscle can produce more energy aerobically and less anaerobically, allowing higher intensities to be sustained before lactate begins to accumulate. Research has shown that the mitochondrial density of elite endurance athletes is 2 to 3 times that of sedentary individuals in their slow-twitch muscle fibers, and that this difference is produced almost entirely by training rather than genetics. Zone 2 training also improves fat oxidation capacity. At Zone 2, intensity, fatty acids from adipose tissue, and intramuscular triglycerides are a major fuel source. Regular Zone 2 training upregulates the enzymatic machinery for fatty acid transport and oxidation, specifically carnitine palmitoyl transferase and the beta oxidation enzymes, allowing the muscle to use fat more efficiently as fuel. This not only improves endurance capacity for long-duration efforts by extending the effective fuel supply, but has significant metabolic health benefits, including improvements in insulin sensitivity and blood lipid profiles. Zone 2 training also produces capillarization in working muscles, meaning the formation of new capillaries that increase the surface area for oxygen delivery and nutrient exchange at the tissue level. It improves cardiac stroke volume through adaptations in the left ventricle, including increased end diastolic volume, which increases the volume of blood ejected with each heartbeat. And it produces plasma volume expansion, an increase in the non-cellular fluid component of blood, which reduces blood viscosity and improves cardiac output, particularly during the early minutes of exercise. The protocol for Zone 2 training, a minimum of 150 to 200 minutes per week, distributed across at least 3 sessions, with each session lasting at least 30 minutes at intensity. The intensity check, you should be able to speak in full sentences, but be breathing more heavily than at rest. If you cannot speak at all, you are above Zone 2. If you can sing comfortably, you are below it. Zone 2, for most people, corresponds to approximately 60 to 75% of maximum heart rate. The second type is long-duration muscular endurance, specifically the capacity to sustain repetitive muscular contractions against moderate resistance for extended periods. The limiting factors here include muscular glycogen depletion and the accumulation of metabolites in the muscle fiber that interfere with contractile protein function. The protocol for muscular endurance training uses sets of repetitions in the range of 20 to 100 repetitions per set at relatively low to moderate resistance, typically 20 to 60% of one repetition maximum. The critical training stimulus is time under tension, keeping the muscle working continuously for extended periods, which creates the metabolic demands that drive the specific adaptations. 3 to 5 sets per exercise, 2 to 3 times per week per muscle group. The specific adaptation that distinguishes muscular endurance training from hypertrophy training is the increase in oxidative capacity within the recruited muscle fibers. Consistent high-rep, low-load training increases the mitochondrial content of the recruited fibers, particularly the type 2A fast-twitch fibers that are recruited at these intensities, and increases the density of oxidative enzymes in those fibers. The third type is the capacity for sustained high-intensity effort in the range of 2 to 8 minutes, corresponding to anaerobic threshold training or Zone 3 and Zone 4 training. This is the intensity range at which aerobic metabolism is still predominating but is being pushed toward its maximum capacity. The protocol uses interval work in the range of 3 to 8 minutes per interval at an intensity that is hard enough that conversation is difficult or impossible, with recovery periods that allow partial but not complete recovery. A specific example, 4 to 6 intervals of 4 minutes at approximately 80 to 90% of maximum heart rate, with 2 to 3 minutes of light active recovery between intervals. This type of training, performed twice per week, produces the most robust improvements in VO2 max of any of the 4 types I am discussing. Research comparing training modalities has consistently found that interval training in this duration and intensity range produces superior improvements in VO2 max compared to Zone 2 training over matched time periods. However, Zone 2 training produces the superior mitochondrial adaptations and fat oxidation adaptations that are the foundation of long-duration endurance. The most effective endurance training programs include both, for reasons I will explain. The fourth type is the capacity for maximal or near maximal efforts of very short duration, typically 8 to 30 seconds, repeated multiple times. The training stimulus here targets the phosphocreatine system's capacity and the specific adaptations in fast-twitch type 2 muscle fibers that improve their capacity for rapid, powerful contractile activity. The neural adaptations from this type of training are particularly significant and are often overlooked. High-intensity, short-interval work drives improvements in motor unit recruitment, the nervous system's ability to rapidly and forcefully activate large, fast-twitch motor units, and in neuromuscular coordination, which improves the efficiency of force production. The protocol, 8 to 10 intervals of 10 to 30 seconds at maximal output, with full recovery of 2 to 3 minutes between intervals, performed twice per week. Sponsor break, 2 to 2 minutes. Now I want to go deep on the neural adaptations that endurance training produces, because this area receives far less attention than the peripheral adaptations in muscle and cardiovascular tissue. The brain and nervous system undergo specific, measurable adaptations in response to endurance training that are as significant for performance as the peripheral adaptations. The first major neural adaptation is raising the brain's effort threshold. With repeated exposure to sustained physical effort, the anterior cingulate cortex and the insular cortex develop a greater tolerance for the effort signal. The same level of effort sensation that would trigger regulatory reduction of output in an untrained individual is tolerated for longer and at greater intensity in a trained individual. Research using neuroimaging to compare brain activation during exercise between trained and untrained individuals has shown reduced insular cortex activation at matched absolute work rates in trained individuals, suggesting that the interoceptive representation of effort is genuinely attenuated by training. The brain has been trained, not just the muscles. The second major neural adaptation involves the motor neuron pool. Motor neurons undergo adaptations in response to endurance training that improve their resistance to fatigue. Research has documented increases in the mitochondrial content of motor neurons with aerobic training, improvements in the vascularization of neural tissue, and changes in the excitability and firing patterns of motor neurons that support sustained activation. Zone 2 training appears to be particularly effective for this type of motor neuron adaptation precisely because of the long duration of sustained motor neuron activation it requires. The third neural adaptation involves the descending pathways from the motor cortex. These pathways become more efficient with training, allowing the same motor command from the cortex to produce more efficient and more coordinated muscle activation. This is a central efficiency gain that allows trained individuals to produce a given amount of work with less neural expenditure. The role of myelination in these neural adaptations deserves specific mention. Myelin is the insulating sheath around axons that dramatically increases the speed and reliability of neural signal transmission. Research on brain white matter has shown that endurance training increases the integrity and possibly the degree of myelination in pathways relevant to motor control and effort regulation. This was long thought to be largely fixed in the adult brain. The evidence now suggests that physical activity, and aerobic endurance training in particular, promotes oligodendrocyte activity and myelin maintenance in ways that have direct effects on neural processing speed and efficiency. BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is released during aerobic exercise in proportion to intensity and duration, appears to be one of the primary drivers of this myelin-promoting effect. The mitochondrial adaptations deserve more specific treatment because they are the most fundamental adaptation produced by endurance training. The primary signal for mitochondrial biogenesis is the energy deficit created by aerobic exercise, specifically the increase in the AMP to ATP ratio that occurs when energy is being consumed faster than it can be regenerated. This ratio increase activates AMPK, adenosine monophosphate activated protein kinase, which functions as an energy-sensing enzyme that triggers multiple downstream pathways promoting mitochondrial biogenesis. AMPK activation increases the expression and activity of PGC1 alpha. PGC1 alpha, in turn, activates nuclear respiratory factors, and TFAM, the mitochondrial transcription factor A that drives replication of the mitochondrial genome. The result is the production of new mitochondria within the trained muscle fibers. Zone 2, training most powerfully, activates this pathway through sustained duration. HIIT activates AMPK significantly through rapid energy expenditure and produces mitochondrial biogenesis through somewhat different downstream pathways. The two types produce complementary mitochondrial adaptations in different fiber populations, which is one of the primary reasons an effective endurance program includes both. The oxygen utilization adaptations include improvements in the enzymatic machinery of the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain, and increases in myoglobin, the oxygen-binding protein within muscle fibers that serves as a local oxygen reservoir and facilitates oxygen diffusion to mitochondria. Myoglobin is what makes trained muscle tissue redder than untrained tissue. The increase in myoglobin concentration with endurance training improves oxygen utilization efficiency in a way that is complementary to the increase in mitochondrial density. Now let me address the crucial topic of hydration and electrolytes in endurance performance, because this is an area where the popular understanding is both incomplete and inaccurate in important ways. Hydration during exercise matters for multiple reasons, but for the specific mechanism of neural fatigue and the brain's willingness to maintain effort, the most important variable is electrolyte balance, and specifically sodium balance in the brain and cerebrospinal fluid. Sodium is the primary cation that determines neuronal excitability. Neurons maintain a resting membrane potential that is partly determined by the sodium gradient across the cell membrane, and they generate action potentials by allowing sodium to rush into the cell through voltage-gated sodium channels. When plasma sodium falls, the condition called hyponatremia, neuronal excitability, is impaired. Mild hyponatremia produces subtle cognitive impairment, slowing of reaction time, reduction in sustained attention, and what subjectively feels like reduced motivation and increased effort sensation. It also directly impairs neuromuscular transmission, reducing the reliability and the speed of signal transmission from motor neurons to muscle fibers. The practical consequence for endurance performance is significant. Even mild hyponatremia impairs the central governor's capacity to maintain output and increases the subjective effort sensation at a given workload. The research on exercise-associated hyponatremia has documented this condition in a surprising proportion of endurance athletes and, importantly, has shown that it occurs most commonly not from dehydration but from overdrinking of plain water. The athlete who drinks aggressively during a long endurance event without consuming adequate sodium dilutes the sodium in their blood, producing hyponatremia despite maintaining or even increasing total body water. This is why drinking to thirst is a more appropriate hydration strategy for most endurance athletes than drinking a predetermined volume of plain water, and why electrolyte supplementation is not just about performance optimization, but about preventing a genuine physiological problem. Sodium needs during endurance exercise vary substantially between individuals, driven partly by sweat sodium concentration, which ranges from approximately 400 to approximately 1,200 milligrams of sodium per liter of sweat between individuals. The practical recommendation: during exercise lasting longer than 60 to 90 minutes, consume sodium alongside fluid. A starting point of approximately 500 to 1,000 milligrams of sodium per hour of intense sweating is reasonable for most people, to be adjusted based on subjective response. Potassium is the second major electrolyte relevant to endurance performance. Potassium is the primary intracellular cation and is involved in maintaining the resting membrane potential of muscle and nerve cells in the repolarization of action potentials and in the activity of the sodium-potassium ATPase pump. During prolonged exercise, potassium shifts from intracellular to extracellular space as a result of the repeated depolarization and repolarization of action potentials in active muscle fibers. This potassium accumulation in the extracellular space reduces the transmembrane potassium gradient and reduces the amplitude and reliability of action potentials in those fibers, contributing to the local muscular fatigue. That is one component of endurance limitation. Dietary potassium adequacy, around 4,000 to 5,000 milligrams per day from food sources, is important for maintaining intracellular potassium reserves. Magnesium is the third major electrolyte relevant to endurance performance. Magnesium is an essential cofactor for over 300 enzymatic reactions in the body, including those involved in ATP synthesis and utilization, in glycolysis, in fatty acid oxidation, and in the sodium-potassium ATPase activity. Research has shown that magnesium deficiency, which is common in the general population due to inadequate dietary intake, impairs exercise performance through multiple mechanisms, including reduced ATP production efficiency and impaired neuromuscular transmission. Endurance exercise increases magnesium losses through sweat and urine, and repeated intense training without adequate magnesium replacement can produce a state of functional magnesium insufficiency. The recommendation is approximately 300 to 400 milligrams of magnesium per day from dietary and supplemental sources, with the glycinate and malate forms being particularly well absorbed and well tolerated. The brain's willingness to sustain effort and how electrolytes specifically affect it brings me to one of the most important mechanisms in the physiology of endurance. The brain's ability to maintain the motivational drive to sustain effort is directly influenced by the ionic environment of the neurons that govern that drive. Research on the adenosine system, which promotes fatigue and sleep pressure in the brain, has shown that adenosine accumulation during sustained effort is one of the primary chemical signals that the anterior cingulate cortex uses to compute the cost-benefit ratio of continued effort. Sodium and potassium balance affects the excitability of the neurons in this circuit, which affects how sensitively they respond to adenosine. Well-hydrated neurons with adequate sodium and potassium gradients are less sensitive to the fatigue-promoting effects of adenosine than neurons operating in a suboptimal ionic environment. This is one mechanism by which caffeine, which blocks adenosine receptors, improves endurance performance. And it is one mechanism by which adequate electrolyte balance sustains the brain's willingness to drive continued effort even as adenosine accumulates. The practical implication is direct. Maintaining adequate hydration and electrolyte balance during endurance training and competition is not just about peripheral muscle function. It is about maintaining the neural conditions that allow the central governor to sustain output near its trained capacity. Now let me discuss how to structure a complete endurance training program that includes all 4 types of endurance development in a way that maximizes the adaptations from each without producing interference between them. The interference effect, sometimes called the concurrent training effect, is the phenomenon by which high-intensity training and strength training performed in close temporal proximity can attenuate the adaptations of each. The molecular mechanisms involve competition between the signaling pathways activated by different training modalities. High-intensity aerobic training activates AMPK strongly. Resistance training activates mTOR. AMPK and mTOR are mutually inhibitory in ways that mean that activating both strongly in the same training session can reduce the magnitude of each adaptation. The practical implications: separate different types of endurance training by at least 6 hours if they must be done on the same day, with high-intensity sessions ideally on different days from Zone 2 sessions when possible. The specific weekly program structure: 3 to 4 sessions of Zone 2 training at 30 to 60 minutes per session. 1 session of aerobic threshold intervals, 4 to 6 repetitions of 3 to 8 minutes at high intensity with recovery intervals. 1 session of short high-intensity intervals, 8 to 12 repetitions of 10 to 30 seconds at maximal effort with full recovery, and 1 to 2 sessions of muscular endurance work. This program, across a minimum of 8 to 12 weeks of consistent training, produces improvements in all 4 types of endurance and in the full spectrum of adaptations, from mitochondrial biogenesis to VO2 max to neuromuscular efficiency to brain effort tolerance. The progression matters as much as the structure. The first 4 weeks should focus on establishing the Zone 2 foundation, because all other endurance adaptations are built on the mitochondrial and oxidative base that Zone 2 produces. The interval work can be introduced at lower volumes in weeks 3 and 4. From weeks 4 through 8, the interval volumes can increase and the Zone 2 sessions can lengthen. Deload weeks, meaning weeks of reduced training volume at approximately 50 to 60% of normal volume every 4 to 6 weeks, are important for allowing full recovery and adaptation consolidation. The role of sleep in endurance adaptation deserves specific mention. Research from Sherry Ma's work on sleep and athletic performance has documented dramatic effects of sleep extension and sleep deprivation on endurance capacity. One study with Stanford swimmers found that extending sleep to 10 hours per night produced improvements in swimming performance, reaction times, and mood that exceeded what any training intervention had produced. Conversely, even modest sleep restriction of 6 hours per night for 10 days produced cumulative performance impairments equivalent to total sleep deprivation. The mechanisms include impaired BDNF release during sleep deprivation, reduced testosterone and growth hormone secretion that impairs recovery and adaptation, elevated cortisol that promotes muscle catabolism and impairs mitochondrial biogenesis, and reduced dopamine receptor sensitivity that impairs the central drive to sustain effort. Nutritional support for endurance training is the final area I want to address. Carbohydrate availability during endurance exercise is a primary determinant of the ability to sustain moderate to high-intensity effort. Research has established that carbohydrate oxidation during high-intensity endurance exercise can reach approximately 60 to 90 grams per hour, which requires exogenous carbohydrate intake during efforts lasting longer than approximately 60 to 90 minutes to prevent glycogen depletion. The specific combination of glucose and fructose in a ratio of approximately 2 to 1 allows the 2 different intestinal carbohydrate transporters to be activated simultaneously, increasing total carbohydrate absorption capacity above what either form alone can provide. For Zone 2 training specifically, training in a fasted or carbohydrate-restricted state periodically has been shown to enhance the fat oxidation adaptations and the mitochondrial biogenesis response, because the lower carbohydrate availability forces the muscle to upregulate fat oxidation pathways more aggressively. Protein intake for endurance athletes requires approximately 1.4 to 1.7 grams per kilogram of body weight per day to support the muscle protein turnover and connective tissue repair that sustained endurance training. Demands: the role of dopamine and serotonin in the brain's willingness to sustain effort during prolonged endurance deserves specific treatment. The dopamine fatigue hypothesis proposed by Romain Musin and colleagues at the Vrije Universiteit Brussels suggests that fatigue during prolonged exercise is partly determined by the ratio of dopaminergic to serotonergic activity in specific brain regions. During prolonged aerobic exercise, tryptophan, the precursor to serotonin, crosses the blood-brain barrier at an increasing rate because as free fatty acid concentrations rise, free tryptophan concentrations in the blood rise. More free tryptophan crossing the blood-brain barrier means more serotonin synthesis. Increased serotonin in regions involved in effort regulation promotes fatigue and the desire to stop. Dopamine opposes this effect and supports continued effort. This is the mechanism by which the specific timing of tyrosine, the dopamine precursor, during prolonged exercise may support sustained effort capacity. Research has shown that tyrosine supplementation at approximately 2 grams taken 1 hour before prolonged exercise can reduce the performance impairment produced by environmental stressors, including heat and cognitive load. The window of benefit appears most relevant for efforts longer than 90 minutes in challenging conditions. The phenomenon of supercompensation is the principal underlying progressive training adaptation. Supercompensation is the process by which a training stimulus creates a temporary reduction in performance capacity during the recovery phase immediately following it, followed by recovery, and then an overshoot of the previous performance baseline as the adaptation is consolidated. The key insight is that the adaptation does not occur during the training stimulus. It occurs during the recovery from it. Training that is too frequent without adequate recovery produces accumulated fatigue without allowing the adaptation phase to complete, resulting in overtraining syndrome. Training with too much recovery between sessions means the supercompensation peak has returned to baseline before the next stimulus is applied, resulting in maintenance rather than improvement. The optimal frequency applies the next training stimulus just as the supercompensation peak is occurring, approximately 48 to 72 hours after a moderate intensity session and approximately 72 to 96 hours after a very high intensity session. The specific cardiac adaptations produced by different types of endurance training produce meaningfully different structural changes. Zone 2 and long-duration aerobic training primarily produce eccentric hypertrophy of the left ventricle. The wall thickness increases modestly, but the internal diameter increases substantially, allowing a much larger volume of blood to fill during diastole and be ejected with each beat. This increases stroke volume and therefore cardiac output at any given heart rate. The resting heart rate of elite endurance athletes can be as low as 30 to 40 beats per minute because each beat ejects so much blood that far fewer beats are needed to maintain resting cardiac output. High-intensity interval training produces a different cardiac adaptation that is more balanced between eccentric and concentric hypertrophy, improving the heart's capacity for rapid force development and high output during brief maximal efforts. The key takeaways from today. Endurance is not a single capacity, but a family of 4 distinct types: long-duration, low-intensity, steady-state endurance, long-duration muscular endurance, high-intensity aerobic threshold endurance, and maximal short-interval capacity. Each has distinct physiological underpinnings and requires distinct training stimuli. The central nervous system is a genuine primary governor of endurance performance. The anterior cingulate cortex, the insular cortex, and the dopaminergic and serotonergic systems all participate in regulating how much effort the brain will allow the body to sustain. Endurance training recalibrates this central governor upward. The primary peripheral adaptations of endurance training are mitochondrial biogenesis driven by AMPK activation and PGC1 alpha upregulation, fat oxidation capacity improvement, cardiovascular adaptations including stroke volume increase and plasma volume expansion, capillarization of trained muscles, and improvements in oxidative enzyme density within recruited muscle fibers. Zone 2, training at 150 to 200 minutes per week, is the most powerful driver of mitochondrial and fat oxidation adaptations. High-intensity intervals of 3 to 8 minutes are the most powerful driver of VO2, max improvement. The 2 types are complementary and should both be included in an effective endurance program. Neural adaptations from endurance training include raising the brain's effort tolerance, improving motor neuron fatigue resistance, improving myelination of motor control pathways, and enhancing BDNF-driven neuroplasticity in regions relevant to effort regulation. Hydration and electrolyte balance, specifically sodium, potassium, and magnesium, directly affect neuronal excitability and the brain's capacity to maintain effort. Hyponatremia from overdrinking plain water is a genuine performance-impairing condition. Adequate sodium intake during prolonged endurance exercise, approximately 500 to 1,000 milligrams per hour of intense sweating, is essential for maintaining central drive. Sleep is the primary recovery and adaptation consolidation variable and should be treated with the same intentionality as training itself. And nutritional support, including appropriate carbohydrate intake during efforts exceeding 60 minutes and protein intake of 1.4 to 1.7 grams per kilogram per day, supports the full expression of the adaptations. That training stimulus produces. All reference research and researchers are linked in the description below. Thank you for your time, and as always, thank you for your interest in science. I want to add several more layers to today's material that complete the picture and make the protocols more immediately applicable. Let me go deeper on the specific neuroscience of perceived effort and the willpower of the brain during endurance, because this is where the training of the brain becomes most specific and most actionable. The experience of effort during sustained exercise is not simply a read of the physiological state of the muscles. It is a construction of the brain that integrates multiple signals: the motor command signal itself, the afferent feedback from working muscles and joints, the metabolite concentrations in the blood and cerebrospinal fluid, the thermoregulatory state, the emotional state, including motivation and mood, and the predictive model of how much more effort will be required. Research by Matthew Pajot and colleagues on the neural correlates of perceived effort has used functional MRI to show that the effort signal during sustained exercise engages a specific network, including the pre-supplementary motor area, the cingulate motor area, and the anterior insular cortex. These regions are also involved in cognitive effort, which is why cognitive fatigue from sustained mental work genuinely impairs subsequent physical endurance performance, and why the mental freshness you bring to a training session is a legitimate performance variable. Research by Marcora and colleagues demonstrated that subjects who performed 90 minutes of cognitively demanding computer tasks before an endurance test to failure performed significantly worse than those who rested, despite having identical physiological status at the start of the test. The only difference was cognitive fatigue, which increased the perceived effort sensation at all exercise intensities through changes in anterior cingulate cortex excitability. Managing cognitive load in the hours before important training sessions or competitions has genuine physiological relevance. The practical tools for managing the brain's willingness to sustain endurance effort fall into several categories that are worth going through specifically. The first is what I call effort familiarity. The more times you have been to a specific level of discomfort and maintained your effort there, the less threatening that discomfort is. The central governor's threat assessment is partly calibrated to prior experience. A level of effort that produces a significant threat signal on first encounter produces progressively less signal with repeated exposure through a process of neural habituation that I described in a previous episode on the mind-body connection. This is the neural mechanism underlying the common experience, that the first time you run a certain distance is the hardest, and that once you have done something difficult, once it becomes easier to choose it again, not just psychologically easier in the motivational sense, but neurologically easier in the sense that the threat signal it generates is genuinely diminished. The second tool is attentional control during endurance effort. Research comparing internal attention, focusing on bodily sensations, with external attention, focusing on the environment or on mental tasks during endurance exercise, has produced somewhat mixed results depending on the intensity and the individual. At moderate to low intensities, external attention, what is sometimes called dissociation, tends to reduce perceived effort and make the exercise more comfortable. At high intensities, where effort needs to be precisely calibrated to avoid prematurely exceeding capacity, internal attention allows more precise monitoring of physiological state and can improve pacing. The practical tool is to practice both types of attention during training. Use dissociative external focus during Zone 2 sessions to make the extended duration more tolerable. Use associative internal focus during threshold intervals to develop the precise effort monitoring that improves pacing and performance The third brain-level tool is what Samuele Marcora and colleagues have investigated under the term psychobiology of motivation, the specific mindset with which you approach an endurance effort. Research has shown that people who frame the physical sensations of intense exercise as energizing and productive rather than as threatening and aversive perform significantly better and report lower perceived effort at matched intensities. This is not merely motivational thinking. The reappraisal of the effort sensation, converting it from a threat signal to an engagement signal, genuinely changes the anterior cingulate cortex's computation of the cost-benefit ratio and shifts the central governor's threshold upward. The practical technique, before and during hard endurance efforts, deliberately reappraise the sensations. The burning in your legs is your mitochondria working at their capacity. The breathlessness is your cardiorespiratory system being trained to become more efficient. The discomfort is the signal that adaptation is occurring. This reappraisal is trainable and its effects accumulate with practice. Let me now go deeper on the role of the autonomic nervous system in endurance performance, because this is an area that bridges the central governor concept with the peripheral physiology in an important way. The autonomic nervous system has two primary divisions: the sympathetic system, which mobilizes energy and increases heart rate, blood pressure, and alertness in response to challenge and demand, and the parasympathetic system, which promotes recovery, reduces heart rate, and supports the restorative processes of the body during rest. During endurance exercise, sympathetic activation drives the cardiovascular and metabolic responses that support the effort. But the capacity for parasympathetic recovery between intervals, between sessions, and overnight is equally important for the accumulation of training adaptation. One of the most specific physiological markers of cardiovascular fitness and of recovery capacity is heart rate variability, abbreviated HRV, which measures the variation in time between successive heartbeats. High HRV reflects greater parasympathetic tone and is associated with better cardiovascular health, better recovery capacity, and better endurance performance. Regular zone 2 training is one of the most powerful tools for increasing resting HRV because it trains the heart and the autonomic nervous system to maintain high parasympathetic tone at rest and to switch effectively between sympathetic and parasympathetic dominance as exercise demands shift. Monitoring HRV daily as a recovery metric using any of the commercially available devices and apps provides a useful window into whether the nervous system has adequately recovered from prior training and is prepared for the next training stimulus. When HRV is acutely reduced below your individual baseline, it is a signal that the nervous system is still recovering and that high-intensity training on that day should be replaced with zone 2 or active recovery. The specific heart rate training zones deserve more precise definition than I have given because the terminology is used inconsistently across different training systems, and the inconsistency creates confusion. The 5-zone system that is most widely used in endurance sports science defines the zones as follows. Zone 1 is very light exercise below 55% of maximum heart rate, characterized by completely comfortable conversation and minimal metabolic demand. Zone 2 is light to moderate exercise at approximately 55 to 75% of maximum heart rate, characterized by comfortable but slightly labored conversation and predominant fat oxidation. This is the zone I have been emphasizing as the primary adaptation driver for mitochondrial and metabolic health. Zone 3 is moderate to hard exercise at approximately 75 to 85% of maximum heart rate, characterized by the inability to sustain easy conversation and the beginning of significant carbohydrate oxidation. Lactate is beginning to accumulate but is still being cleared by nearby tissues. Zone 4 is hard exercise at approximately 85 to 95% of maximum heart rate, characterized by the inability to speak more than brief phrases and by lactate accumulation that exceeds the clearance rate, producing the burning sensation and the rapid onset of fatigue that characterizes threshold efforts. Zone 5 is maximal exercise above 95% of maximum heart rate, sustainable for only brief periods, and corresponding to maximal glycolytic and phosphocreatine contribution. For practical training purposes, the most important distinction is between Zone 2 and everything above it. Zones 3 through 5 are all high-intensity training from the adaptation perspective. The differences between them in terms of which energy systems predominate and which adaptations are most stimulated are meaningful for competitive athletes fine-tuning their programs, but are less critical for the majority of people seeking health and general performance improvements. I also want to address the topic of lactate more specifically, because it is one of the most misunderstood molecules in exercise physiology, and its misunderstanding leads to training errors. Lactate has historically been characterized as a waste product of anaerobic metabolism, a metabolic dead end that accumulates during intense exercise and causes fatigue. This characterization is incorrect in important ways. Lactate is a metabolic intermediate produced during glycolysis when pyruvate is converted to lactate that serves as both a fuel and a signaling molecule. Lactate produced in fast-twitch fibers during intense exercise is transported to adjacent slow-twitch fibers and to the heart, where it is converted back to pyruvate and oxidized for energy. This lactate shuttle, first described by George Brooks at UC Berkeley, means that lactate is not simply a waste product, but an important fuel that can be utilized by oxidative tissues while glycolytic fibers are working at high intensity. The lactate threshold, the exercise intensity at which blood lactate begins to rise significantly, is not simply a sign that metabolism has shifted from aerobic to anaerobic. It is the intensity at which lactate production exceeds the combined clearance capacity of the lactate shuttle. Training raises the lactate threshold by increasing the oxidative capacity of slow-twitch and type 2A fibers to process the lactate produced by glycolytic fibers, and by increasing the density of the monocarboxylate transporters that facilitate lactate exchange between fibers. Understanding this changes how you think about lactate threshold training. You are not simply training to tolerate lactate accumulation, you are training the oxidative capacity that allows higher glycolytic rates to be sustained without net lactate accumulation. The practical implications for training are significant. Lactate threshold training, which is the third type of endurance I described earlier, specifically stimulates both the glycolytic capacity of fast-twitch fibers and the oxidative clearance capacity of slow-twitch fibers, improving the overall integration of the energy systems. And Zone 2 training, which keeps you just below the lactate threshold, specifically trains the oxidative capacity that clears lactate. Both are necessary for a well-developed endurance capacity. The athlete who only does high-intensity work develops glycolytic capacity without proportional oxidative clearance capacity, resulting in lactate accumulation at relatively low intensities. The athlete who only does Zone 2 develops oxidative capacity without the maximal glycolytic capacity that high-intensity efforts require. The integration of both types produces an endurance system that can sustain high intensities aerobically, produce high outputs when needed anaerobically, and clear the metabolic byproducts of those efforts efficiently. Let me also address the specific role of altitude training in the context of this episode, because it represents a powerful tool for those with access to it and illuminates the mechanisms of endurance adaptation more broadly. The primary adaptation from altitude training that improves sea level endurance performance is the increase in erythropoietin EPO production that occurs in response to hypoxia. EPO stimulates the bone marrow to produce more red blood cells, and more red blood cells means higher hemoglobin concentration and higher oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. The standard protocol is live high, train low. Athletes live at altitude typically between 2,000 and 3,000 meters, to stimulate EPO production and red blood cell mass increase, and train at lower altitude to be able to train at higher absolute intensities than altitude allows. The benefits of altitude training persist for approximately 2 to 4 weeks after return to sea level, as the red blood cell mass that was stimulated by altitude EPO gradually normalizes. For the vast majority of people without access to altitude training, the behavioral and training tools described in this episode provide a more practical path to endurance improvement. I want to close by addressing how different sports and different goals should prioritize the 4 types of endurance training differently, because context matters enormously for program design. For general health and longevity, Zone 2 training is the highest priority endurance investment. The metabolic health, cardiovascular health, and mortality benefits of consistent moderate aerobic exercise are the most robust and most clinically significant findings in all of exercise science. 150 to 200 minutes per week of Zone 2 training, sustained over years and decades, produces a VO2 max trajectory that is profoundly different from the sedentary trajectory and is associated with dramatically better health outcomes at every age. For competitive endurance sports, including running, cycling, rowing, and swimming, the effective training model combines a large base of zone 2 work, approximately 70 to 80% of training volume, with strategic inclusion of threshold intervals and short maximal intervals, approximately 15 to 20% of training volume in moderate and high intensity, respectively. This polarized training distribution has been shown in multiple studies of elite endurance athletes to be more effective than moderate intensity continuous training that tries to split the difference between zone 2 and threshold work. For sports that require repeated explosive efforts with brief recovery periods, such as team sports, combat sports, and racket sports, the muscular endurance and short interval training types are more directly relevant than long duration zone 2 work, though a foundational level of aerobic base still supports recovery between bouts within a game or match. The most important single investment you can make in your endurance at any age is establishing and maintaining a consistent zone 2 practice. It is not glamorous training. It does not feel particularly hard. It does not produce the satisfying exhaustion of a brutal hit session, but it is building the mitochondrial and cardiovascular infrastructure on which all other endurance capacity depends, and it is doing so through adaptations that compound beautifully over months and years of consistent practice. Every session of zone 2 training adds mitochondria to your slow twitch fibers. It expands your plasma volume. It trains your heart to pump more blood with each beat. It teaches your muscles to use fat more efficiently as fuel. It lowers your resting heart rate, and it builds the aerobic foundation that makes every other type of training more effective and more sustainable. Start there if you are building an endurance practice from scratch. And if you already have that foundation, add the interval work that will drive your VO2 max upward and develop the full spectrum of your endurance capacity. As always, thank you for your time and thank you for your interest in science.